Welcome to the Therapist Burnout Podcast, episode 84. Hey, therapist. Today I am going to have another Ask Me Anything episode. I have been putting up some videos on Spotify. So if you're in there, hey, how's it going? It's me. I almost changed the music too because I was like, I need a better beat. Can I get a better beat behind what I'm saying? You know? And I started my YouTube channel. There's 6 people on there. So if you're on YouTube, smash that subscribe button. Maybe we can make it 10 this week. Woohoo. But I do have podcast listenership. I'm playing around with video. I'm not going to say I'm doing video every time. I'm in my salty hoodie today. And so it's fine. We're good. Today, I have someone who asked me this question. I wanted to know how the process has gone. Podcasting is what they're asking about, and what the response has been. I've been thinking about potentially doing it in the future, and I'd love to know how you found it so far. So it's a pretty general question about podcasting. And so this might come out around the 2-year mark of this podcast. Let's say, yay, I've podcasted 2 years. This is the episode. I'm recording it on Tuesday night at 7:12 p.m. There's nobody in my house, which is weird. It's just weird. Yeah. So podcasting. How did I start podcasting? I started podcasting. This is a journey. In COVID, I found podcasts. I had not listened to podcasts before COVID. So I was a podcast listener and I was like, oh my gosh, you can just like listen to audio. I started doing all my trainings through podcasting or through audio. If a course doesn't have an audio component, I'm like, forget you. I don't have time for that. So I launched the TBI Therapist Podcast in 21, and I launched that really, I think, because I wanted to specialize more in focusing on that specialty. So I had gone into working with brain injury survivors. I did a postdoc in neuropsychology. But I did some neuropsychological reports, but I really worked mostly as a rehab psychologist. And what I found is that once I got out of working in neuro rehab, I was an outpatient and I was one of like 3 providers who provided care to people after brain injury. And a lot of psychologists or counselors would not touch the concerns related to someone who had a brain injury. So they would say, well, I need to refer you out. It's not an area of my competence. The problem is not a lot of people have a lot of competence in this particular issue or concerns. So I do have passion about therapists learning more about brain injury and how to treat brain injury since I don't do the work anymore. I need somebody to do it. Please, somebody help these people. So anyway, I decided to do this podcast because I really felt like it would be great information for people to know, to share more survivor stories. And also the brain injury conference I would go to here in Maine, and I just love that conference. It was such a beautiful gathering of survivors and professionals. And I just loved it. And I was like, let's bring that out to a podcast, kind of getting information from different professionals, from survivors. So, and so that was part of my why. So, one thing I think is to have like a why. Why are you doing this thing? But my other why was also because I was hopeful to be successful in a private paid practice. So I also wanted to use this as a marketing tool to hopefully build a greater level of expertise, which I really didn't need. I had plenty of expertise. I did not need this podcast to work to further cement my expertise to get more private pay clients. I think if I were to go all in on a private pay practice, I think today I would just focus on more network marketing. So contacting various organizations. So trying to contact the local organizations like within my state to hopefully just beef up my referral network. Because I think most people are not going to find me as a therapist through a podcast. Probably not a local therapist, in my opinion, especially for my demographic. So, my demographic of people with a brain injury, a lot of those people can't work. So, to have a private pay practice for people who there are so many P's, you don't know how many times I'm slipping up on these P's, y'all, today. So to have a private pay practice on that particular niche, I feel like it's tricky because many of them aren't working. So unless they're like independently wealthy and just have money to kick around, maybe not the best demographic to launch a private pay practice with, although it was good. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because that the biggest payer of the time that I was working, insert four-letter acronym, did not pay me for 6 months. And so the math didn't math for that. So I was like, no, I can't do this anymore. So that made me go into a whole shit ton of scarcity. Let's just name it. And then I was like, okay, maybe I'm going to launch intensives. I want to do this podcast. I'm going to do all these things. And then hopefully I'm going to get these private pay clients so I don't have to deal with insurance anymore. I feel like that's kind of when I look at it now, I don't think I had that was going on. I think I was already in this like sympathetic dominance with COVID and kids were young and I'm trying to care for them. And what I said the whole time is that I wanted to work with therapists on burnout and compassion fatigue because I wrote my dissertation on it 15 years ago and I wanted to work with therapists. I've always wanted to have a group of therapists. I was thinking I was going to try to launch some kind of group practice and all that mix because I wanted to be with people. And it's the more I tried in private practice to do that, it seemed like it was really hard. I didn't realize how hard it is to gather therapists. It's like herding cats. Therapists are a hard bunch to herd. We are just squirrely. And so I didn't find that working for me. And I would feel jealous about people who were building practices. I mean, it was just like, why do they get that? And I mean, all the things. So I saw that first podcast as a failure. Yeah. And I'm seeing it differently now. So now I see it as like, that was like a book, I kind of see it similar, like podcasts are kind of in a way my version of book writing in that if you write a book, not every book is going to be the book that gets published or the book that takes off or the book that you want to keep writing in that genre, right? So perhaps it could be you hold whatever idea you have lightly and you think about multiple whys. Why do I want to do this? Am I doing this for my art? Am I doing this for my personal expression? And when I started the Therapist Burnout Podcast, I made this decision that I wanted to do this more as some self expression. Yes, because a lot of it is my story. And the other part of it, I wanted it to be like a gift to the world. Let's go with this question. Maybe answering like how the process has gone for me from launch. I started this podcast, like recording the episodes as I was closing my practice, which is crazy to me now. uh, which I tell people not to do things like this when they're closing a practice because I have been working mostly with therapists on closing their practices, which I never would have thought that's what would have come out of this. So that's another insight that I'll just share in a minute. I started recording the episodes as I was closing my practice. And I think at first I felt like I needed to know everything about burnout. And the longer that I've gone in talking about burnout and researching burnout, yes, we know the definition, we know how it's different, but the unique flavor of therapist burnout, which is really just not burnout itself. There's compassion fatigue, there's moral injury, there's our identity, there's all kinds of things that are unique to the work that is weird, that is therapy. Therapy is just weird. It's a weird relationship. And so, of course, it's going to be different. Our, manifestation of what burnout is for our profession is just different than anything. And so it surprised me that I started out really kind of researchy and I need to know all the facts, which I did a dissertation on this. It's almost like I forgot that I have been in some kind of trauma work my whole career. So I started as a foster care caseworker, and that led me to start this interest in trauma work when I started my doctoral program in 2006. So almost 20 years ago, I've been in these trauma streets. And so I think what it's taught me is that I know a lot more than I thought I knew, and the knowledge from myself, me as a human, is the most important knowledge that I'm bringing to this podcast now, although, of course, it's informed by my education and training, which I value, and I lean on research. I bring that stuff in. You guys know that. I'll bring in research studies. But I think listening to myself more is important. And I think that has a lot to do with impostering that is huge in our field. I think especially therapists who are mostly female identifying struggle a lot with feeling like we know what we know. I want to answer this question. What kind of feedback have I gotten from therapists, from listeners? So I will tell you from launching 2 podcasts that you think you're going to launch your podcast and you're going to get this huge response. You won't because no one knows about it yet. And that's good and bad, right? Because no one's going to like find you just from launching a podcast. You really, really have to tell people about it. And my tendency when I launched things was to launch and hide. I think you guys will understand like why I have this sentiment. And I'm just starting to be able to feel more visible. Like I'm showing my face more, which I feel like is kind of weird that I have like a lot of hangups from, and I haven't really talked about this much on the podcast, but just in body image and how I show up in the world physically. So I think I will probably talk more about that in the next year. I feel like it's coming. I think the feedback that you get is slow and it helps you know where to go with your work. So I was so surprised that mostly the therapists that I've worked in consulting wanted my help with practice closure. I would not have thought that is what something that I develop a course on, which I'm developing now. And so it's just interesting where the podcast can take you. Also, on the difference between burnout and depression, that's been one of my top downloaded episodes, which it makes sense because there's a lot of similar criteria in both burnout and depression. And I think, does one cause the other? Yeah, so much to say. And so I want to do more work in that area, especially in the area of clinician mental health, which I was shocked. I just did a recent episode on clinician mental health. There is just a dearth of research. So I feel like I need to put out a survey. I just feel like it's something I need to do just to understand it more and to help people know that they're not alone, that there's other people that are struggling with depression and anxiety. And so I've been real vocal in sharing my own concerns related to depression and anxiety on this podcast. And so when people reach out, they send me emails, and I'm so grateful because I know it's landing. I know people actually listen because it's just me in my office. You know, I don't have an audience of people that I have in this room to get feedback from, like, hey, what did you think about this? Or what did you think about that? And as a presenter, when I present things, typically I will, get feedback from people. I'll talk with people and see how it's landing, right? And I think I've had a number of these questions of other therapists who want to start a podcast. And part of me is like, am I going to need to like do I've said, like, I do not wanna help people launch a podcast or help people launch some kinda online program, but people have been asking me to do that. And there's a lot of bad information out there on how to launch an online business or a podcast that is just I would not recommend. So part of me is like, I want to help the therapist not struggle like I did in my first podcast and really think about the reasons why they're doing that. And I think that's, probably one of the biggest pieces of wisdom I would offer you is to think about, is this just for self-expression? Because there's a lot of ways to express yourself that don't create as much work as a podcast. I think it does have to feel like something like a vocation for you. So for me, I really think about I have been a teacher in many roles in my life, and I feel like I continue to do that, and I do enjoy it. So I do enjoy it, and it's still a lot of work. So my podcast takes me probably 4 hours a week. It is labor intensive. I feel like it's getting easier. There's a lot of things to learn. I mean, just like how to podcast get out in the world. And so it's a skill that I have now, and in learning that, I think I like editing. So I do everything. I do everything associated with this podcast. My hope is that actually it's not my hope. That is so funny that I just said it's my hope. Because I used to say my hope is that maybe it will get big enough. Maybe I will do this as a full time career, and, that will be something that I do. And I'm not saying that anymore, which is interesting. So I think now my relationship with my podcast is that I committed to myself to do this podcast for 100 episodes and then reevaluate the podcast because I really wanted to give it that amount of time to see if it goes in a direction that I feel like is fruitful for the listeners. And I feel like I gave the project a good amount of time. So I think having multiple whys, if it's part of a topic that you've had for a very long time, if it's part of a book that you have written, if it's part of something that's attached to your business, I would just really love podcasting and talking and having conversations if you want to do this. It's something I really do enjoy as I think self-expression and also getting information out there. So I had no experience podcasting before, how to position the mic. I did opt to get this fancy mic that is like $400. I usually don't recommend that because I just don't want people spending that much money. Maybe I'll put together like a whole sheet of what equipment to get if people want more information on this. How to decide on your format. Are you going to host a solo podcast? My podcast tends to be mostly solo episodes. For me, it's hard to schedule a guest. It's more like my life where it's a struggle for me to schedule guests in. I think sometimes I want to have guests in more because I do like the conversational nature of podcasts. I like to listen to them more, but it is easier, I think, for me to record a solo episode. And I would say also regarding solo episodes that if you want to be viewed as the consultant and potentially have people hire you, I think it's important that you do some solo episodes because if you are just interviewing people, a lot of times people guest on podcasts to show their expertise, to market their own services, their practice, their coaching offers, their trainings, for example. So, if your podcast is something you hope to sell courses with or consultation with, then from a marketing perspective, I think it does make sense to do primarily solo episodes as a way to showcase yourself as the expert on that podcast. Because when I do interview episodes, the focus is on my guest. It's not on sharing my expertise, my knowledge, my experience on whatever it is, podcasting, burnout, career pivots, the things that I talk about here on this podcast. So I would just say if you are in doubt, start with a solo podcast and perhaps have guests on. I think to bring energy in, and the way I use my podcast is for networking too. So, networking with other podcasters to spread the message of your podcast and also the reach of your podcast is important to have other guests on. So, I'm thinking about this more and more. And I think your network in podcasting is important. So, having relationships with people who can promote your work on a regular basis is really important. So I have been working on those relationships this year, and I think going deep. And this marketing principle really does apply itself if therapists are in private practice or for any business that you have regular people that will share your work out in the world, whether it be your therapy practice or your trainings or whatever thing as an entrepreneur that you want to share with the world, a consultant. So thinking of your podcast's guests as people that you might want to have long-term relationships with is really important. And I think, yeah, I've had big guests on the show, people that have, a lot of experience and expertise in the field. And those aren't often the episodes that are the most downloaded sometimes. Those often don't produce the goals, perhaps, that I want this podcast to have, right? For people to share the episode, for people to find the podcast. I think thinking of what your goals are in general from the podcast are important. And then trying to figure out, like, okay, if I am going to be focusing on being the consultant on my podcast, then I want to showcase probably myself in about three-quarters of my podcast content. So just a little tip there. And then the length of a podcast, I think my solo episodes tend to be 20 to 30 minutes. And when I have a guest on, it tends to be 45 minutes to 60 minutes, just depending on that guest. And I do recommend starting out podcasting weekly if you can. If you can't do it weekly, then every other week. Really, it just needs to be a cadence where you feel like you can do it and to commit to doing it if you're going to do it for, at least 40 episodes to see if it's something that's meeting the goals that you want it to have. If it's part of your business and you hope to reach a wider audience with your message and your work, then I think that's more acting as a marketing tool than more of like a self-expression tool. I think I hear this a lot from therapists. They're scared about how much to share of themselves on their podcast. It's different for me now that I no longer work as a therapist. I think previously when I hosted my last podcast, I did not share as much of my own personal struggles on my podcast, TBI Therapist. And so many of the times when people are starting a podcast, it's based on maybe a struggle they had. And really, it's a personal choice. I would just say we are humans. We're allowed to have human struggles. We're allowed to talk about those personal human struggles if we want to on a podcast. Of course, it could have implications for your work. And you might want to think about, could my client find my podcast? Would that impact the work that I do with that client negatively, perhaps? Do I need to talk with them about my public presence and that I can't be on social media and I can't have them on my email list for confidentiality reasons? So you might want to run through all of those things and just think through it a little bit if it would affect your clinical work. I would say the first part of launching your podcast is the hardest. Getting started is the hardest part. And thinking about those first 4 or 5 episodes, I think having 7 ready to go when you launching with 3, and then having 4, because you get into this content cycle. I produce content weekly and I produce it every week. I don't batch record anything. I think maybe before vacation, I might do 2 together, perhaps, but it doesn't work for me to batch record. Like, I'm going to do 4 podcasts in one day and then have them go throughout the month. Maybe one day I'll do that. I don't know. If this becomes more of a full-time gig, that's fine. I don't have a cherished outcome about that right now, but I'm committed to doing this through the end of this year. And then I am going to reevaluate and just see where things are with me and my life and what I need. So I think that's always a good thing to think about. Like, I'm going to do this for 6 months weekly and then see how that feels. I think for therapists, you have a unique lens on many difficulties that other podcasters may not have. I think we make the best interviewers. We understand emotions very, very deeply, more than other podcasters may. And so I think that's a unique reason for therapists to put their hat in the arena to podcast. And I think to think of yourself now, like whoever's listening to this, you're listening to this and you have this desire, you have this idea, you have this topic, and you want to get it out into the world. And I think the one thing I would tell you before you launch or before you think about launching a podcast is that just to hold it lightly. I think I called my practice my baby. My other podcast was my baby. And I love Liz Gilbert's words. Like, if anything, you are the one that is putting this thing out there in the world. Like, it is not my baby. It is for the world. This information is for other people. So it can't be mine anymore. Like once I put it out there, it's not mine. And that's the way I see it with my old podcast. Like I still receive messages from people about that podcast. Like, thank you for putting this out there. And while I'm not engaging with that audience anymore, I mean, I still do. I'll answer emails and stuff, but I've already launched it. Like if you launched a child, you grew them all the way to adulthood. Yeah, in some ways but they're not a baby anymore. They have grown, they have left, they have launched, and we have to let them go. So I would say hold it lightly and let it go. And maybe think of yourself like, would you regret not launching? Is this the right time for launching something like this in your life? I don't know if you could have stopped me from doing it. I just don't know. I think I had this almost irresistible impulse to do it. And maybe you do too. Maybe that is your impulse. Maybe you've had this impulse for a while. Maybe it's a book. Maybe it's a blog you start with. But you have this desire to get your ideas in the world. And a podcast is one vehicle for that. Maybe it would be better served in a book or a blog or starting to write on social. You can still start today without a full launch, by the way. You can still start getting those ideas out in the world. But if you do want to launch a podcast, I would just learn more about podcasting in general. So, some of the people that I learned from were Adam Shively, and he hosts the Podcasting Business School. I don't receive any kickbacks, but he is great, and I've enjoyed learning from him over the years. I'll link that in the show notes. There was also a journal. The journal is by John Lee Dumas, and it's like something like how to launch a podcast. I'll also put that. I used that to launch one of my podcasts. I can't remember which one it was, but I used that book and that was really helpful. I think I used his program. Actually, it was a course that I used, but the book I found had all the information in there. And I think the book is like $20. So certainly you can grab that book and just start reading. And it's like a workbook. You can just start working along and getting those topics down that you might want to think about. And then perhaps starting to record some episodes and see how that goes. So I wanted to jump back in. It's a different day if this video happens, because my brain was just thinking about how to market a private pay practice because maybe some people are going to do that, right? So I wrote down a couple little sticky notes for you about my thoughts about that. So when I first launched TBI Therapist, my hope was to use that of somewhat as a vehicle to promote my own private practice and hopefully, like I developed this whole program for people recovering from a brain injury as well, and hopefully to go into some kind of coaching offer from that. So maybe I was thinking of coaching, but anyway, if some people think of like, hey, a podcast is kind of the tip of the marketing spear, this is how I'm going to get the word out about my offerings, then I would think of two things, right? If you're going to market your private pay practice, to think about that referral marketing first, perhaps. And so for my niche, I came from neuro rehab. So I certainly had contacts in neuro rehab that I can continue to work and let them know my practice was out there. And so those could be neuro rehab centers, certainly for my niche that I could have marketed to. There's all kinds of a host of services for people with a brain injury. And so those would be like neuro rehab centers, hospitals, perhaps other practitioners. So other allied practitioners like physical therapy, speech therapy. And so for folks that are looking to market to perhaps a neurodiverse population, using your allied health providers it's a really, really great idea. And even if you're thinking about offering coaching, I know sometimes other allied health professionals may not want to refer to coaching, but if you have the credentials, which most people that listen to this podcast have the credentials or are on their way to be licensed as a therapist, then perhaps that's another great marketing tool. We forget that other therapists are great referral sources. So I know when I became full in private practice, I was often looking for referrals because sometimes my clients needed a different type of modality that I didn't do. Perhaps I needed to refer to a couples therapist. And by the way, couples therapy is very easy to do private pay with because there's not a good route to get reimbursed. It's much more difficult, as we know, if you do that kind of therapy. Also, I see a lot of posts in local Facebook groups. So that's another great place to put it. But if you're thinking of the podcast as marketing a coaching or consulting offer, perhaps you're thinking of, I want to do consultation on whatever it is. Maybe it's somewhere. I've seen a lot of therapists who do coaching consulting in dating or in relationship coaching. So perhaps it's in that niche. And perhaps you want to do individual consulting on, let's say, dating or relationships, something of that nature. It's not a mental health focus, but you want it to be more of a coaching or consultation offer. I think that a podcast could be a great tool for that if you are in a specific niche, which segues into my second thing I wanted to jump on here a couple days later after I recorded the first one and talk a little bit about how do you make money from a podcast? And if I ask, I love the cousin test. In marketing, people say, what is the cousin test? Can you literally ask your cousin, what do you think I'm talking about? And it's so funny because my cousin is actually on my email list. And she sent me a message. She was like, I don't know whatever email service you're using, but that email was fantastic. I really loved the formatting and you looked like a pro. So I was like, wow, I passed the cousin test. Woo. That's great. Shout out to my cousin. You know who you are on the podcast. And yes, I'm going to send her this clip. And love her. She is wonderful. She's about to have a baby, and I'm so excited for her. Okay. Please start with a niche. Please start with a niche. Why? 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 And I know we talk about this as therapists and in private practice as well, because people want solutions to problems. They don't want a vitamin. So we're not up at 3 a.m. looking for like, oh my gosh, I need vitamin C and D and elemental P. No, we are not looking for vitamins at 3 a.m. in the morning. We're Googling, we're putting in podcast players, the problems we have. So, like when I started a podcast, I was looking for podcasts on podcasting. When I was struggling in private practice, I was looking at podcasts on private practices, but people do put in a podcast player, Therapist Burnout, for example. So that is why I changed my name. It was initially, this podcast was Joy After Burnout or something like that for therapists or whatever. And prompted by my coach, Adam Shively, who will probably forever be my podcast coach because he's just awesome, was like, we name our podcast really straightforward. So don't get too creative with your podcast name or your practice name either. So this is just a marketing principle. We want something to be findable. So putting in something like Therapist Burnout Podcast, people will look in their podcast player for Therapist Burnout or Burnout, and that will come right up in their podcast player. So that will be highly searchable and findable. And these principles apply to whatever niche you're thinking about. If it's estrangement. So I've seen a lot of therapists in the coaching groups I've been in who are kind of marketing to folks who might be estranged from their own family. So think about, what are they putting in a podcast player? They're probably, there are so many P's today. They are probably inputting family estrangement and kind of focusing on that keyword. Yeah. So people are not looking for holistic living, Awaken the podcast, Dr. Jen podcast. There's a million Dr. Jens in the world, by the way. So no one is searching for Dr. Jen podcast. And my name is really long, Dr. Jen Blanchette. It's so many. I told my partner there's too many letters in her last name. And why we want to pick something that people can put in a podcast player is because, as I told you before, when you launch a podcast, no one can find it. And so unless you don't want people to listen to it or you don't want to do any marketing from it, if it's purely self-expression, that is fine. So it could be like, what would I do? I'm trying to think of the funnest podcast I would do, like coffee chat about tennis and hiking. I don't know, with Jen. Yeah, if I just wanted to talk about, this is what I talked about on my walk today. If you guys wanted to hear that, maybe you would. This is my mental drama about tennis. I'm going to put that, in a podcast. I don't know if people will listen to that. I just don't know if they would. And I think most people that start a podcast eventually want to make money from it. That is part of what they want to do. And as helping professionals, we are pretty bad at marketing and selling and asking for the sale, including myself. I am not great at it, although I'm getting better and I've learned some things about it. And I really think of podcasting as a free service that I'm providing. So I'm providing knowledge, information, other stories of burnout, and perhaps how to get permission to leave if you want to leave the field. I've had people message me just from my podcast that said, you gave me the courage to leave my job and I did it. Thank you for this podcast. And if you have to leave it, one person put, if you have to leave your podcast, that's okay too. I get it. So, yeah, I really think of this as your free offering. So, you are putting this free content out into the world. This is your free offering. So, asking for something paid is to support your free work. So, my free content I put on LinkedIn, this is my free content on my podcast. And so, I'm still quite in the negative as far as free and paid work for the amount of effort I'm still putting into this podcast, then I get paid for doing the labor that it entails into my podcast. And I've accepted that as part of the long game, right? That I'm putting this work in now and that it might turn into more consultative work, perhaps, that I want to do, groups for therapists that can support the work that I do for the free content for this podcast. That is my vision. And my mission is really to serve more therapists. So if that is my mission, I do need to get paid more from doing activities associated with this podcast. So it makes sense that I need to ask for the sale. And for like individual work or more close knit offers, that needs to come at a premium to support the free work that I provide to people that just listen to this podcast for free. So I hope that can be a helpful reframe into asking for money for when you want to offer something on the other side of doing a podcast. And I think of like people don't get paid by advertising money unless you are Joe Rogan, unless you are Mel Robbins, or you have a big following. Most people are not going to get paid. You are not going to make money from advertisements. It will be like $5 a month. So just a drop in the bucket. So most people need to do their own consultation work to get paid from their podcast. So, and doing a simple offer. A lot of people start with these big programs. That's how I started TBI Therapist. I wanted to launch a huge group program. And I think a simple 12-week coaching offer where maybe you meet with them weekly, every other week, whatever it is, and you just coach them on the, whatever they want you to work on. And so when I started the Therapist Burnout Podcast, previously Joy After Burnout Podcast, I started that way. I started with doing a lot of consult calls, which I told myself I did not want to do. I did it anyway. I told myself I'm going to work individually with people and do these consult calls to understand what people needed from me. And I really saw those again as a gift of my time and doing my own market research to see what people needed help with. And I found that most people, when they wanted to pay me, would be for practice closure. I've helped therapists with launching their own offers, launching their own podcast as well, and other ideas like that. But primarily, it has been when either their practice has been really out of control to the point they just really didn't know what to do next. And the other half was closing their practice down or severely reducing their practice offerings. That I found people wanted my help with. And so sometimes we have this idea of like, I'm going to start this podcast and do this. And then when you start doing it, the actual people that listen to the podcast want your help with that. And so that's what I found is that I am helping people with the problems that they want me to help them with, not with what I think they want me to help them with. So that is a key distinction to really follow the breadcrumbs of who is actually paying you and what are the problems they are paying you to solve. Then we continue to do that work and we continue to do those offerings if it still fits with what we want to do. And I think that's another one. Like, can my nervous system hold this? I found that helping therapists close their practices was actually a pretty heavy lift on my nervous system. So that is why I still feel like it's good information that I want the world to have. And so I'm developing curriculum around that. So what I found is that actually doing the offers, I want to do that more in a different way. So I'm creating the curriculum around practice closure and I'm offering office hour support. And so really individualized support still, but the course is really doing the heavy lift on what the actual how to do and then having more group support around like how do I manage this emotionally and office hour support on those logistical pieces that people do struggle with in practice closure. And I have really been leaning into like what is the work that I want to do as well? Like, what's going to bring me joy? And so I'm thinking of like bringing a group of therapists together in some kind of way to think about like, what is the next step? Like, what if I've left therapy or if I want to leave therapy? Like, what is next for me? And I was getting in, so I did a career coach certification to kind of help with that. And the more I'm finding I've delved into kind of career pivots, the more I'm like, we need to really get experts on rest, figure out our nervous systems and what they can hold in our next role, whether that be a job, whether that be, I don't even want to think about a career after being a therapist until my nervous system is in a better place. So perhaps pivoting to a job that I can hold on to for now, to just nothing else. It's just going to pay the bills. There is that. Let me know any other questions you have. So every month I ask for questions from my listeners on my email list. So that's the pen pal list, the therapist pen pal list that I will link in the show notes as well. And so if you want to have a question answered on the podcast, I'll do that for you. Okay. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Have a good one.